Member for Fong Lim.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. There is a degree of civility that has descended upon the House, mercifully, in respect of this debate, and an aspiration for cooperation going forward in this space, which is clearly something that affects all of us across all electorates. So I'm going to try and honour that as well and temper what I have to say in that regard. I'm quite confident that there is somewhere beneath it all a shared aspiration amongst all of us to reduce harm in the Northern Territory, and there is no doubt that all of us acknowledge that alcohol lies at the root of a lot of problems that we have in the Northern Territory. At the risk of being a teacher's pet or sycophantic, I'm delighted to have heard from the member for Araluen. And I say that on the basis that I may have gotten the most kindred spirit in terms of a rational, academic, empirical and or economic contribution to the debate from somebody who has seen this over a long time horizon. I note that there are other people like the member for 𝙲𝙗 who similarly have been through various iterations of trying to deal with how to address the vexed issue of alcohol policy and what the right mix is. And unlike the member for Berkeley or the member for Breitling or the member for Catherine, I don't actually have a nexus to these problems in the electorate I represent in quite the same way. That's the honest truth of it. I represent a lot of businesses and a lot of people who live in fairly affluent suburbs who aren't really affected by this issue in a meaningful way. And that's all the more reason why I freely admit this is not my area of subject matter expertise. And I'm mindful that I contribute to making a decision here that affects places where this is quite literally life and death, I'd say. Alcohol policy, generally speaking, is what I'm talking about. And that's why I personally do what I can with the tools that I have to take the time to look at what the evidence and the data, the great evidence and data that we keep on bandying around in general terms, actually says. And I'm encouraged that since we started sitting in this House in October, that everybody's upping their game a bit in relation to bringing forward a diversity of opinions. And what's really clear from the debate we've had today is that there are a range of data sources and a range of evidence, anecdotal, empirical, peer-reviewed, weight of testimony, lived experiences, ministers, people who've been in Parliament for 5 terms, and all of that does add up to something. And really what it adds up in this regard for me is there's a lot of uncertainty. Nobody's got any definitive wisdom on how to deal with alcohol policy definitively. But I'm quite clear, looking through hundreds and hundreds of articles and hearing everything that everyone else has to say, that the silver bullet is a minimum unit pricing. And that's why I'm sufficiently satisfied to vote with my government to say that this is essentially a piece of legislation that is, a straw man. It's not achieving what it was intended to. It may not be doing any harm. It may not be doing any good. It could be doing some harm if you control for other factors. It's very difficult to say. But as everybody freely admits around here, we are not interested in living in a prohibition state, nor do we think that we would ever raise the minimum unit price to a point where it's punitive on the wider Northern Territory populace. And so on the basis of all of that, rather than having some sort of culture war about it or empirical battle about whose data is better than anyone else's data, I'm simply going to point out a couple of bits here which say to me, getting rid of this, I think, is fine. I don't think it will cause any great harm. I'm not convinced that it will cause any great good. But I hope what we move towards is a more holistic agenda that this government will hopefully lead and will work in partnership with people across the House on. So I have reviewed more than 100-odd papers in relation to this. And the fact is they're predominantly about Canada and they're predominantly about Scotland. Because those are the places where people have been really genuinely interested in digging under the hood to see, does minimum unit pricing work? Under what conditions does it work? What do you have to do? What are the levers you have to control and pull to make it basically function? Now, mercifully, I will not, in the interest of time, cite hundreds of papers today. What I want to do, though, is simply is point out essentially the contrary view is the one that is applicable, in my opinion, in this place. So I'm not going to demonstrate the weight of opinion in defence of my position, because the weight of opinion in the literature is that minimum unit pricing in other jurisdictions has been quite successful, right, in respect of population level effects. But my contention, based on my reading of a lot of data and a lot of studies, is that is simply not the case in this place. And I am validated in maintaining that position, not just by the member for Breitling's on-ground testimony, but probably much more so, with no disrespect to him, given the member for Aralur's testimony in respect of all the different levers we have tried to pull over time. The recent focus in the literature is always about Scotland. And it's because that's where people have invested the most in terms of the debate, where there are the most heavy drinkers drinking concentrated high-proof alcohol. The public health debate is set up in a very specific way there. And the nuts and bolts of it are that, you know, less than 18 months ago, there was plenty of stuff out there, some of it driven fairly, in fairness to some of the critiques that are put out there by the alcohol lobby and industry groups, to suggest that it wasn't doing any good in Scotland. It just simply wasn't doing any good in Scotland. There's plenty of stuff to suggest that, but there's also plenty of stuff to suggest that actually was working pretty well at a population-based level for them. And so on the basis of that, you know, minimum floor price, which was set in 2018 at 50p, 50 pence in the UK, was actually up to 65 pence to adjust for inflation and to continue having essentially the same effect, so that they can run a more controlled study. So it is working there to a certain extent, and they've decided to run with it as a public health policy measure as a result. But it didn't start yesterday in Scotland. This is the thing. The focus is like it's a policy that we grabbed from Scotland a few years ago to try and save us here like it's a silver bullet. Simply not true. The honest truth of it is that minimum pricing for alcohol was introduced in Ontario, in Canada, in the, I think, the 1920s, soon after Prohibition was repealed, right? So this has been around a long time. And the reason it was around originally was because minimum prices were being used to stabilise alcohol markets that were operated by government alcohol-controlled monopolies, which was an important source of government revenue at the time. So this goes back a long further than just dealing with problem drinkers, right? This was a serious economic agenda at one point. And widespread adoption across all Canadian provinces began in the 1990s, when there was more evidence to suggest that there was a generalised public health benefit controlled across population groups. But the thing is, again, we only ever talk about those two countries, whereas in actual fact, countries have MUPs for spirits, a lot of them, but not for alcohol more generally. And we're including countries like Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Russia, right? Where it's been difficult to evaluate what the unique effects have been, owing to multiple policies being enacted at the same time. That's the point I'm driving towards here, right? So controlling for what the cause and effects are is very difficult. And I'm going to come to what I think are the best control studies in our space in a sec. But the reason I mention that laborious backstory is to explain that if you can't control for the effect, there's no point dying on a hill for this. And I'm convinced that there's no point dying on a hill for this one measure, which I don't think is having a significant or a statistically significant effect on minimising alcohol-related harm. There's been considerable interest, as I said, in evaluating the effects of MUP in Scotland. And as a result of that, it's been introduced in Wales in March 2020 and in the Republic of Ireland in January 2022. And it's very much stalled in the UK because, again, people are not convinced that it might not disproportionately, punitively affect one group of people without actually fulfilling its stated aim, right? And that's the real challenge here. How do you put something in place to actually be effective as a policy? MUP is also under discussion in Northern Ireland. It's not been implemented in England, as I say, and even in South Africa, which is, you know, not a vanguard jurisdiction for trying to do this kind of work, there's been modelling to work out, is this going to help us reduce heavy problem, chronic, alcoholic class drinkers? right? And in most of these places, they haven't gone ahead with it. And most of the time, it's because nobody is willing to actually bite the bullet on pricing this so high as to cause a significant disincentive to drinking. And without wanting, as I said, I'd try to be civil in this debate. My contention is that there has never been a serious effort to use MUP here to reduce alcohol-related, crime or problem drinking. $1.50 was always a very low target, even when it was introduced initially. The Labor government had its opportunity to fight for this as a matter of principle a long time ago. And if they wanted to burn the political capital on pricing this extremely high and causing population-level effects to reduce alcohol consumption in the Northern Territory, they could have, but they chose not to. And so we've been stuck with a policy that is in no man's land and does very little other than to basically punish the populace without even delivering anything back into the rehabilitation space or into the restorative space. It's not like the markup on this money goes back into the health system. This is just going into retailers' pockets, right? So we're not pricing anyone out of the market, and everyone gets it. And I think nobody has more credibility making that argument than, again, I don't want to seem like a teacher's pet, the member for 𝙼𝙗𝚻𝙗, simply pointing out again that people have the means to purchase at this price point. And I can't speak for the government in totality, but I cannot see any version of a future where we make the minimum unit price $10. And so on that basis, this is largely a moot argument. Now, there is a litany of research about this. I had a look at, 250-odd papers and did the best I could to make some sense of it. Didn't read them all cover to cover. But what I would say is that one of the best sources to get information about this is the BMJ, the British Medical Journal. There's a ton of stuff about minimum unit pricing in there. There has been over a range of years. And as I said, I wouldn't cite hundreds of articles, but I will point out just one article here. And it's an article from last year by Anderson et al. And it's in the British Medical Journal, and it's entitled Minimum Unit Pricing for Alcohol Saves Lives. So why is it not implemented more widely? Right? I'm not shooting myself in the foot, relax. I'm trying to let you know that there is stuff out there saying that this works just fine in some other places. But the whole point I'm making here is it is not working in our jurisdiction. Now, the key argument that these authors, who I have no bone to pick with otherwise, make, is that two major arguments impede the wider rollout. The first argument is that minimum unit price will not affect the intended target group, people who are very heavy drinkers and who might be dependent on alcohol, and might disproportionately penalise those with lower incomes, including those who are lighter drinkers. The second argument is that minimum unit price might lead to increased production and consumption of illicit alcohol, particularly in low-income settings. So those are the arguments posited for why this is not more widely rolled out. And this article goes on to make the case for those two contentions not being true in the context of the spaces that they are working in. The irony is, it's those two arguments that prove why this is not worth maintaining in this place. That's exactly what happens here. What we are basically doing is punishing the majority for the sins of the minority without affecting the people who are most in need of help. So this is a straw man policy. So I think we can all, with clear conscience, get rid of it and move towards a better future where we cooperatively work under the auspices of this government to try and come together with a better set of ideas for how to manage alcohol policy. And we've heard some really sensible things bandied around. And again, I maintain I am just not a subject matter expert in this area. I can't say with clarity what will and won't work. But I'm compelled by what I hear across the floor, and there must be a better consensus position with which to move forward. Now, what I have maintained in this House consistently is that context matters. And that's the thing, like drawing random bits of this to defend my weak position here and a bit of that, it's not helping us. It's not helping us progress the debate in respect of anything. And we will keep having to face tough discussions about tough areas over the next few days, no less. And if we just consistently cling to the crappiest one-line bit of data that we've got to be able to justify our position, we are going nowhere. I don't want to foreshadow again debate that's coming, but We are doing our best to be tough on crime and to restore, to reduce crime and reduce, confidence, safety and security to the Northern Territory. That's necessarily had a knock-on effect for correctional services and the justice system. So we have to do something about that. We can't be willfully blind to it. So I'm not foreshadowing debate. I'm simply saying that when we have these arguments more generally, we need to start thinking holistically about how to solve problems rather than just figuring out how to shoot down that line of argument based on one line item of data. Because we're just not moving forward. We will not move forward as a Northern Territory to solve any problems unless we are able to have a more mature debate. So I welcome that we're bringing information in, but let's be specific about it and let us agree to disagree rather than simply say your data is garbage or my data is, superior. What we have here is the most compelling evidence in this space that suggests to me MUP hasn't worked very well. So it's not that MUP never works. It does work in some places. It's just that it doesn't always work, and I would argue it hasn't worked here. And this is not a new argument I'm making. On the 22nd of October, I spoke in this chamber on the matter of public importance in relation to domestic, family and sexual violence. And in that debate, I shared with all of you a small portion of what I learnt in preparing for the stuff that we debated in October. And I'm not going to reiterate it with specificity, but I'm going to just flag it again. I've raised recurrently the need to be mindful of expert evidence with specificity rather than in generalised terms. And there were two articles I pointed out that day, both by Sarah Clifford and others, Clifford et al. 2024, Sarah Clifford based at the Menzies School of Health, and they're from the International Journal of Drug Policy and they're from the Drug and Alcohol Review. One was called, "What are the impacts of alcohol supply reduction measures on police-recorded adult, domestic and family violence in the Northern Territory of Australia?" And the second was called "Police-Recorded Adult Sexual Assault in the Northern Territory, Australia, Alcohol Involvement and Alcohol Policy Effects." Now, the reason I cited those things specifically was because they're recent, they are geographically specific to the place we're in. They're not about what's happening in Scandinavia or Timbuktu or Aberdeen, right? The contributing authors have real skin in the game where we are, and the bodies that they're associated with are the core bodies that we're trying to work with, like the Menzies School of Health. Now, I sought really hard that day, I say this with sincerity, to avoid cherry-picking data selectively to distort the argument or to distort the totality of the work. I spoke to the parameters of the studies and their conclusions instead by using specific quotes I read in totality from the abstracts, from the conclusions, and I encourage you to go back and look at it again. And what those, now I'm paraphrasing to be clear, what those journal articles suggested was that when you controlled for everything, the only thing that probably had a statistically significant impact was PALIs. And again, I just don't have the lived experience to be able to support that, but it does seem like police auxiliaries, which the member for Breitling and 𝙼𝙗𝙗 both maintain were probably the single most effective tool that we've had in this space for a number of years. Statistically speaking, in a controlled study with some, proper rigour, that seems to be the thing that had the greatest impact. Now, it's not that MUP couldn't have more of an impact. It's not that banned drinkers register might not be part of the solution. The whole point about it is that we just cannot hitch our star to one single wagon here. That's where we're going wrong with a lot of these debates. And, the whole point is if we're going to have evidence-based strategies going forward, right? Evidence-based means something specific as well. And we have to be clear that what's been done over the last 8 years in particular, but even longer than that, clearly doesn't have strong evidentiary support. That's the thing, it doesn't have strong evidentiary support. The package and totality of the previous government's alcohol harm minimisation legislation has not amounted to statistically significant improvement in most spaces. We're able to isolate singular pockets of improvement, but we're not able to find definitive, overarching, overall, this is definitely the thing that's working. We cannot afford to lose this. It's just not there. And so we have to come up with something better. And I hear lots of reasonable ideas, and I'd like to see us talk about them in whatever context, under whoever's introduced notice or bill. I would like to see us come up with a coordinated plan and strategy for that going forward, because I genuinely think it may be the one issue that we all are bound by and just cannot avoid. Like, it's absolutely the case that we cannot avoid talking about alcohol and alcohol policy in this place. There is no strong evidentiary support for what's been done for a while, no matter what our intuitive or anecdotal feeling. And that's the problem with some of what's been presented, with respect, by the opposition and the crossbenchers. Intuitively, it seems a good idea to place a minimum unit price in. Intuitively, it seems like it might be something that might work here based on it having worked well elsewhere. But it is just that, intuition. It is not a substantive evidence proposition, or it is at a very minimum a contestable position. And if I had to fight for arms of alcohol policy, this would be the one I'd fight the least hard for, because it's pretty clear based on the controlled evidence that it's the weakest part of it, statistically, anecdotally, empirically. So I have no problem in supporting its repeal in that regard. Now, I will not, I won't descend to unduly politicising the debate, because I think, as you know, as the preceding speaker pointed out, it's been a civil and constructive debate, and it's one we will return to. I simply will note, though, the idea that the pricing put in place by the previous government was quote-unquote fair and equitable is, I think, disingenuous. I disagree with that proposition. I think it was weak and a token effort at best. If we wanted to use minimum unit pricing as a policy mechanism to genuinely influence population level effects, as well as problems for seriously chronic alcoholic level drinkers, the price would have been much higher a long time ago. So spare me the arguments about, you know, once we remove this, the ceiling will fall in. I don't believe that will happen. I simply don't believe that will happen. Having said that, I respect the fact that people are fighting for this, not in no small part because they want to reduce harm and they want to do good. And as I say, I believe that is a shared aspiration for all of us in this place. So let's come up with a better set of strategies to ban behind in that regard, because I, for one, don't believe that minimum unit pricing is the strategy behind which we need to all get behind. Internationally, the strongest support indicates, as I say, population level effects. But I'm happy to say, in my assessment, is unclear at best regarding evidence for whether MUP substantively assists chronic and heavy drinkers. In sum, we need to address alcohol policy in context-specific ways. That's the language I'm using for what other members have expressed in relation to local solutions, community solutions, you know, working with people on the ground, working with people, you know, in community. But context specificity is what will take us forward in this regard, because we need to think about the people in our jurisdiction that have a problem with alcohol and what their specific preconditions are, how they behave as economic agents, rather than relying on what happened on the other side of the world and assuming that it will work here. I believe the CLP is genuinely committed to moving constructively forward in this space, and I would encourage all of us to think about how to make constructive contributions to debates on alcohol-related policy going forward. And on the basis of all of that, I am happy to commend this bill to the House. Thank you, Madam Speaker.